It's been 10,000 years. And we finally got a lore update. So why do I feel confused? And scared? Well, yesterday we got a brand new dev update. It's an update that talks about future champions, Skarner, and some gameplay changes. But more importantly, it also mentioned what happened to League's lore and what its direction for the future. And this update is so massive, I will split all the news into two videos. So today we are going to have a look at League's lore, and tomorrow we'll have a look at Skarner. Now, before we dive into this, there is something I should mention. A few months ago, when I visited Riot headquarters, where I snooped around and I did some interviews, I actually visited the League IP offices, which can be considered the center of League's lore. And I got to talk to the team myself. So while the dev update told us a lot about Riot's future plans, I got some more information which you might be interested in. So because there really is a lot to talk about, let's get on it. The lore part of the post begins with Brightmoon and Meddler tackling how League's lore worked in the past. It was mostly champion bios and short stories. But over time, as it scaled up, there were more sources injected into it, such as Legends of Runeterra or Riot Forge. So after that, they cut to Laura, who is the head of League's IP. Or in other words, she is the head of the team that takes care of everything that is connected to Runeterra. In this update, she goes into detail how the introduction of more sources of lore also introduced some inconsistencies. Stuff like Udyr being rewritten like 3 times, Sentinels of Light doing silly things because they wanted to sell skins, or how some storylines got opened and then totally ignored somewhere else. In fact, Laura actually gives some 2 other good examples. The invention of Hextech on one side is close to someone like Skarner, Seraphine or Camille, and on the other side it was first created by Victor. Or how Yorick just got forgotten during the Sentinels of Light. From this update we learned that the team wants to avoid these situations, because it makes the world feel less believable and it undercuts meaningful character development. So here's the big reveal. Going forward, starting today, everything is canon. No more of League's universe being split into multiple versions. That being the core universe, the Legends of Runeterra version and the Arcane version. All of which previously had some minor differences in their stories. From now on, everything is in the same universe, no matter what. Which means that all future events and all future updates to champions will be consistent with the story across everything that Riot makes. However, because this is a pretty big deal, getting into that place of everything being consistent is not gonna happen immediately. They will not immediately retcon everything that is not part of the new unified universe. Instead, whenever they add in something new, again going forward from today, it will all be part of the new canon. Laura then mentions that the team knows that this will be hard to pull off, but they believe the payoff will be worth it. After which, it cuts back to Meddler and Brightmoon, who give us a bit more examples of what's going to happen in the future. Here we learned that while some cinematics are fully aligned with the new canon universe, others are still not. So going forward, all cinematics, including the one with Aatrox we are getting soon, will be fully integrated into the story. Another example they pulled up is Skarner's update. His relation to Hextech and the origin of that technology doesn't really line up with how it was established in Arcane. This would also include other champions such as Camille or Seraphine. So his ASU will serve as a great opportunity to just update that entire part. Which also means that yes, Arcane is now fully canon. For those of you who don't know, that was not the case before. In fact, one of the most popular videos on this channel is me explaining the differences. But more about that in just a moment. And as another example of future storytelling, they also brought up Song of Nunu, which of course is coming up at the beginning of November, which they confirmed will be fully canon and it will push the story of the Freljord forward. Though they didn't mention any other of the past Riot Forge games. So we still don't know what's happening there. And then, finally, Meddler gives us one more big update. Apparently, over time, the team purposefully moved away from short stories. Meddler admits that it was a great way to expand the story of their champions, but at the same time he confirmed that the vast majority of players never engaged with it. Which I fully believe. I mean, my entire career is standing on the shoulders of people who are too lazy to read. So moving forward, we shouldn't expect many short stories, if any. And instead, they will focus on more engaging ways to expand their lore. Which, I have to say, absolutely makes sense. In fact, this is something we have suspected for a while. That's why neither Briar nor Naafiri got a color story. It was obvious that despite League's lore being godly, most people never engaged with the stories. And they only learned about that from YouTubers who made entire careers on that. And being one of them, I'm not mad. I do believe it is the right decision to move away from walls of text. Yes, they were amazing, and for a good while they kept this channel alive. But I'm not gonna be selfish about this. I'm not gonna hold them accountable for moving away from the tiny niche audience to serve the masses. After all, if Riot can find better ways to show their universe to more people, it's gonna be better for everyone. I just hope that the sacrifice is gonna be worth it. But now, since that's where the lore update ended, let's break it all apart. And let's talk about some of the things that weren't mentioned. What we learned here today sounds amazing. There are many excellent reasons why this is great, but there is also a really scary, chaotic underside. You see, those of you who have followed the lore of League of Legends for a while now may realize that we've been here before. This exact thing has happened in the past. In fact, I can pinpoint the day it happened the first time to Aurelian's release. Before the release of Aurelian, the story was kinda there. It had some great moments, such as the Burning Tides, but that's really all we got. Some new champions and some good moments. Well, starting with Aurelian, every champion suddenly started feeling more meaningful because all of them got color stories, which were the extra stories that pushed the universe forward. And from that point on, Riot treated their universe as a new version of it, one that would slowly retcon all the bad things that didn't make sense. So all together, as all the champions started coming out, slowly they started rewriting all the old stories of Runeterra. Of course, this was then followed with bigger updates to entire regions, with the climax being the release of the map. And yes, I still remember the scary times before we even had the map. So just like what is happening now, the stories slowly and over time got to shape the great lore we have now. So speaking of now it's happening again. Which is scary because it feels like we are back at ground zero. Like, I know they mentioned that most of the things are coherent and in line with the new lore, so most of the things will not be retconned. But since we still don't know which parts will change, it kinda feels like nothing is canon until proven otherwise. I mean, really, I don't think I can confidently tell you which parts will stay canon, because literally everything can change at any point. The good news is that it can only change once before it is shaped into the new universe. But the point is, everything can change. Again, the idea of the update is great, but the team is definitely facing an insane challenge. For example, as was mentioned here, Arcane is canon. But Meddler also mentioned that Legends of Runeterra is mostly in line too. And these two together already rewrite a lot of the stories. So just to give you the scale, let me give you some examples. Varus' original story ended with him in the middle of the desert looking for his sister. It was a really cool cliffhanger. Fast forward to Legends of Runeterra, that threat was totally ignored as Varus started fighting Zolani. Speaking of which, what's going on with the entire conflict of Aatrox, Scale and Rise? The legendary sculptor Durand, who created Galio, and who, according to Swain, died with his secret of how he created him, now has a whole family who can create similar constructs. Gnar, who was supposed to be the last prehistoric Yordle, is no longer the last prehistoric Yordle. Heimerdinger actually most likely has the T-Hex now. How is he gonna get to that point from Arcane? Speaking of which, according to Arcane, not only are magical teleporters now connecting some of the regions, but it seems like it was Ryze who gave a powerful gem to Jace, even though he's all about taking power away from mortals. And at the end of Arcane 1, it was speculated that Singed could be Orianna's father, which I guess will not be true, because what's gonna happen to Corin Revek, the actual father who appeared in a Riot Forge game? Or maybe Orianna was adopted? Or maybe she was developed in a tube? Look, both of these could be possible. But at least, now we finally officially know that Yordle's glamour is no longer canon. Yordles are no longer hiding from racist Piltovans. Speaking of which, the bio of literally every champion from Zone and Piltover will have to be rewritten, because some of these are vastly different from Arcane. I mean, somehow, in Season 2 of Arcane, Victor has to get a lot angrier. Which also means that we are most likely losing the League of Legends version of Singed. Which I am actually sad about. Singed in League was so much better than what we got in Arcane. I mean, in Arcane, he is also great, but it's still not even comparable. Singed was such a great and calculated mastermind. And he even got the best horror story this universe had ever seen. And unfortunately, that story does have some inconsistencies when compared to Arcane. There definitely are ways they could make it canon, and I really hope they do. But I'm still sad there is a very high chance we are losing that version of Singed. But there are also some brighter sides. For once, Legends of Runeterra made some champions incredibly cool. An excellent recent example would be Janna, who now became a great believable spiritual deity. Also, the Grey Legion may be fully canon now. And let's not forget about Seraphine. In Legends of Runeterra, Seraphine is really awesome. And since they have to rewrite her origins when it comes to Hextech, they pretty much have to go with this version of her story. Also, since Legends of Runeterra and Arcane are now part of the same universe, we better see Von Yip in Arcane 2! Another thing to point out are the cinematics. As we mentioned, not all of them are canon, but we still didn't learn which ones are those. It's another guesswork which the community has to figure out. Again, it feels like nothing is canon unless proven otherwise. I assume New Dawn is not canon, but Awaken is? So how will we learn what is actually canon now? Also, as silly as it may sound, we should expect more cinematics now. Maybe kinda how we got 2 for Viego and then also some cutscenes for the Sentinels? Because after it was confirmed that short stories are simply gone, I still don't believe the pace of how the story is developing forward is going to change. Unless Riot starts pumping out more cinematics and new games, what we got now is what we'll get in the future. It will be new champion bios, new season start cinematics, and whatever comes up in other games. So now the story really is going to be carried by Riot Forge and Legends of Runeterra. This was a meme in the past, but now it's very real. It may not be driving profits, but it will now be the main source of lore, which is very cool. But the scary thing is that when they are talking about all of this, they are only talking about their future plans. They always mentioned that everything is ramping up in the future. Which means that while all of these updates are really nice, it will take time before we get something more meaningful. As an example, I'm not going to expect anything to happen to the Universe website for a while. Because even on Reddit they confirmed that at some point, the team would like to give it an overhaul, but it is not their immediate priority. Which makes sense, I mean, we're not getting short stories anymore. So all you can do is turn it into an archive for champion bios. And maybe give it some links to cinematics. And on that topic, a piece of information I can also give you is that the team wants to update the map. But again, it will take some time before that happens. And again, it makes sense why. If we assume that the MMO is currently building itself on top of the map, it would make sense to give them the priority over what they want to do with it. After all, the MMO is gonna be far more important than making sure a champion placement is pixel perfect on the map when it comes to their bio. So maybe after the MMO settles down on a good layout, we can then get an updated version of the map. Just keep in mind that this is all just a theory, I don't actually have any insider information. Although, with that said, since Legends of Runeterra is now getting canon, me constantly using it as an example for things appearing in the MMO is going to pay off now. Which is where it might be a good time to mention my visit of Riot's headquarters. When I was at the IP office, I got to see how dedicated the team is to actually making consistent stories. One great example I can give you are the aspects. Apparently, the aspects are somewhat of an internal joke for them because they were rewritten like 3 times. They had 3 canonical versions. Not to mention that we call the champions aspects, but also the celestials above them are aspects too. So as one example, they are actually working on unifying all of these issues. Another thing I can mention is that as I walked around, I saw how the team is making sure that the timeline works too. And they also had all the concept art for all the things that were previously random, but now they are trying to make more sense of it. Now, I'm not saying all of this because I want to leak some insider information. I am being very vague on purpose here. Which, to be honest, even if I told you everything, I don't think I would spoil much. I purposefully tell writers not to spoil anything for me because I want to experience the story with the community. But rather, I am mentioning all of this because it shows how dedicated the team actually is to this universe. And at this point, I feel confident their vision is great for what is to come. But the issue still is, when will that come? And when it comes, will there be enough hype to back it up? Speaking of which, let's go back to Riot Forge Games for a moment. It was confirmed that Song of Nunu will canonically move the story forward. Which kinda makes me think, is this why Song of Nunu was delayed by a year? Was it to make sure that its story is aligning with the new lore? But then, what about Convergence? Convergence might have some parts that will clash with what's happening in Arcane. In Arcane, we are not sure if Echo has parents. There, he was kinda presented as an orphan. But in Convergence, the majority of his story is happening around his parents. So are we just supposed to forget about that game now? At least Mageseeker should be mostly fine. As far as I know, that game doesn't really have anything big that would clash with the canonical lore. Which means Yops is fully canon now. But then, this entire update starts making more sense when you look into the distant future. We know that Project L is coming, and that the same IP team is looking into it too. Meaning that, for example, when Project L comes out with its champion lineup, it is likely they will have some kind of narrative reason for all the fighting. Though we don't really know how far they will lean into the lore. But at least visually and thematically, they will all be part of the same universe. All of that should be consistent. Which, by the way, it now absolutely makes sense why in Project L, Echo has the arcane design. Also, this update means that the narrative of future projects, such as the MMO, is gonna be a lot stronger now. Whenever you see a champion in the world, you will not question which version of them is it. You will now know exactly who you're dealing with and why they are a big deal. Which is something that definitely shouldn't be overlooked either. But all of this also has a little bit of a darker side. Remember how a while back a lot of people were confused and mad that a lot of Riot's writers are leaving? It felt so random because the stories were so good and still the writers were leaving left and right. Or in some cases, they were let go under some questionable circumstances. Yeah, as awful as it is, I think that one makes sense now. It makes sense why the writers who essentially funded the universe are no longer at Riot. It's because League now doesn't have a use for all the short stories they used to write. On top of this, if we go back to the time when we didn't get a cinematic, some of you may remember that I did kinda snap. And I do believe it was justified given the fact that we were not getting any content, and all the amazing writers in the front lines were getting heavy death threats to the point where they had to lock their accounts, while everyone around the leadership stayed quiet. That one simply didn't feel fair for the players or all the rioters who took all the hate despite having nothing to do with this. I just couldn't believe what was happening. And so I started my own investigation. I looked into all the writers who were fired. I looked into all the managing positions Riot was looking for. And more, it seemed like there was someone at Riot who essentially acted as a dictator for League's IP. But it was all just a speculation, it fell off, and so in the end I just backed away from that. The interesting fact about that one is that while the direction of my digging was somewhat close, the reality was totally elsewhere. If you remember all the amazing writers who funded this universe leaving Riot, well, it happened because internally there was a disagreement over how this universe should be going forward. I don't really have any more details on this. This is really all I know. I think it is possible that some writers liked how the universe was going at that time, with the main universe branching out into the Arcane version and the Legends of Runeterra version, with all the color stories kinda tying everything together. But others possibly wanted to have everything united. So when, for example, a new Arcane season comes out, that series would be fully canon in a singular universe. It certainly seems like this was the main point of conflict. I mean, again, it's awful, but it makes sense. For years, you have all the writers who are writing all the short stories, only for them to realize that their work didn't have enough traction, and for another medium to come in and essentially overwrite everything you've done. So when you look at this entire situation from a distance, it makes sense why all the writers left, even though some of the circumstances of how they left remain questionable. And I have to say, this entire situation feels like a big gamble. Because now, after Riot has already spent a lot of time uniting everything, I mean, it's been over a year since the last time we got anything, so people are waiting for something awesome in return. Which means that Riot's following steps will make or break the trust of League's lore community. It's been running on life support for a while now, so now they have to make every step count. There is no room for mistakes. Because if Riot somehow drops a big bomb now, I can guarantee you, people will just stop caring about this universe outside of bigger media drops. Which leaves me with one final note regarding this channel. No matter how frequently the stories will or will not get updated, I don't know if I'll continue covering the stories the way I used to in the past. I don't know if I'll release a video talking about every champion after their bio gets updated. The truth is, over the last 2 years, the content on this channel changed a lot. And it was only recently, and I really mean maybe the last 6 months, where the audience started adapting, the views started going back up, and the channel finally started heading in the right direction again. And to be honest, I am very happy with how this channel is doing right now. One of the hardest thing a YouTuber can ever do is get out of their comfort bubble when it comes to their content. Because the moment you start doing things differently from what you've done in the past, everything will go down. And that's regardless of how well you have everything planned out. And believe me, I spend a lot of time on YouTube just researching videos. The thing is, you can't really blame the algorithm for this one either. The algorithm is not a magical word that is responsible for every channel crumbling. Sometimes it's just your audience that is expecting different content. That is the reason why you won't get views. Which is why, in my case, things were brutal. And even though I have never talked about this before, when League's lore stopped, I got into a darker place. Because I knew the kind of content my viewers wanted to see. But that content simply ceased to exist, and I had nothing to talk about. So I was forced into adapting my content or letting my channel die. The issue is that when you change your content, you have to get a whole new audience for it. Which means that when that happens, the views go down, all the graphs will go red, your motivation tanks as a result, and overall it is just a dark spiral that tanks your mental health. I went through all of that as I was desperately trying to find a new kind of content that I can make. Which is why I am very happy to say that it took me a year and a half, but I believe I did it. I broke out of the old content and I started making videos that not only make me happy, but also videos that people simply like. I know we have recently talked about some drama, but I always present it with a bit of humor, and I simply enjoy writing the jokes for it, which is something I just couldn't do when I was covering the lore. When covering the stories, at times I really felt like a slave to the content. Like, I felt like it was my job to cover it. If I didn't, people would miss out on some really cool stories. And in a way, there were people who relied on me. But looking back, I can tell you with confidence that's just something I made up in my head. Because, truth be told, the videos where I simply talked about what was happening around League of Legends started doing better than me just blindly talking about the lore. And there is a very good reason why that happened. Yes, there really were some people who were waiting for me to cover some of the stories. Like, yeah, thank you for those comments. Those totally helped my mental health. You should always force content onto content creators. But more than that, the people who liked the lore as much as I did just read the stories themselves. Those would be the same people who then looked for my videos. And often they watch them to just see my perspective on it. Not necessarily to listen to me read it word for word. So when League's lore slowed down and the general interest in the lore vanished, only people who stuck around were the core nerds who already knew all the stories. Which also meant that, in a way, me covering all the stories became pointless. And suddenly, the success of my videos relied on how hyped people were around champions. That's why if you go back, you can see that people didn't care about me reading the color stories. Because of course, those people have read them themselves. Whenever a lore video got bigger traction, it's because the general public got interested in a champion. As a result, only new champion releases or some of the more interesting topics were doing well. Besides those, most of League's players just didn't care about the lore. And the remaining interest just vanished when the universe went quiet. And I'm afraid I'm at the point where going back to how things were before is impossible. Partially it's because my audience changed, but also because I don't wanna be a lore archive anymore. I don't wanna be a content slave. I still love the League of Legends universe, I always will. And yes, it is likely that we will talk about the new stories. But it's also likely that when we talk about them, it will be within a more interesting context than just me being a reading bot. So, why don't we have a bit more fun with it?